The October sun of 1800 mercilessly baked the deck of the American frigate George Washington, anchored in the harbor of Algiers. Captain William Bainbridge, a man of honor and an officer of the young United States Navy, stood on the bridge, gripping the railings until his knuckles turned white. Before him unfolded a scene that was to become an indelible stain on the reputation of an independent nation, yet paradoxically served as a spark for the transformation of a former colony into a world power. The local ruler, the Dey, issued an ultimatum reeking of medieval despotism. Either the American warship would become a courier vessel for transporting tribute and envoys to Constantinople, raising a foreign flag at its mast, or the ship would be destroyed by shore batteries and the crew sent into eternal slavery. Bainbridge, assessing the hundreds of cannons pointed at him, was forced to comply. The sight of the stars and stripes, lowered to make way for the symbols of the Ottoman Empire, became a visual embodiment of America's geopolitical impotence. At that moment, no one on board could have known that this humiliation would trigger a chain reaction of events that would forever change the rules of the game in international waters. This situation was not an accident or an isolated misunderstanding, but a logical outcome of a system that had developed over centuries. The Mediterranean Sea, the cradle of civilizations, had, by the beginning of the 19th century, turned into an extremely dangerous trap for merchant ships without a powerful navy backing them. The Barbary states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco, had built a unique economic model based on state-sponsored piracy. This was not chaotic banditry, but a well-oiled business where fear was sold for gold. European powers, seemingly possessing insurmountable military might, preferred not to fight, but to pay. The logic of London and Paris was cynical and pragmatic. If they paid ransom to the pirates, their ships passed freely, while the ships of competitors from weaker countries were attacked. Thus, the Barbary corsairs effectively did the dirty work for the great powers, eliminating economic rivals through others' hands. For the young United States, this system became an existential threat. After gaining independence, American merchant ships lost the protection of the British Royal Navy. Now, sailing into the Atlantic and heading towards Gibraltar, every captain risked not just his cargo, but also the freedom of his crew. By the end of the 18th century, the United States was paying colossal sums. Almost 20% of the annual federal budget went to ransom captives and pay tribute to North African rulers. This was an economic bleeding that the young republic could not endure forever. However, the problem lay deeper than finances. The very idea that a free nation should buy the right to exist and trade from sea bandits contradicted the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. The question was stark. Either America accepts the rules of the old world with its corruption and might of law, or it tries to establish the might of force and justice. At this critical moment, Thomas Jefferson entered the historical stage. Taking office as president in 1801, he brought with him a deep philosophical conviction that ran counter to the practices of his predecessors. Jefferson, by nature an isolationist and opponent of large standing armies, paradoxically became a hawk on the issue of the Barbary pirates. Even as ambassador to France, he tried to organize an international coalition against this racket, but failed due to the indifference of European courts. Now, holding the power of commander-in-chief, he faced a dilemma. On the one hand, building an ocean-going navy required enormous expenditure and could provoke conflicts with European giants. On the other hand, continuing payments meant acknowledging his own weakness and endless dependence on the whims of tyrants. Jefferson made a cold, mathematical calculation. War, however expensive it might be, would in the long run be cheaper than constant tribute. But most importantly, the honor of the nation has no price. The situation escalated to the limit in May 1801. Yusuf Karamanli, the Pasha of Tripoli, deciding that America was not paying enough compared to Algiers, demanded an immediate increase in tribute. Not receiving the desired response, he committed a symbolic act of war. His men cut down the flagpole in front of the American consulate. This was an open declaration of hostilities that could no longer be ignored or bought off with money. Unlike previous years, when Washington's responses were full of diplomatic evasions, the reaction was tough. Jefferson, without waiting for a formal declaration of war by Congress, sent an observational squadron to the Mediterranean. This decision became a precedent of colossal importance. The president used his powers to protect American interests thousands of miles from home shores without direct authorization from legislators, which forever expanded the interpretation of presidential power in foreign policy matters. The conflict began to unfold on an external, visible level as a classic naval blockade. American ships, superior to the Corsair feluccas in firepower, but inferior in maneuverability in shallow waters, attempted to close the ports of Tripoli. It was a game of cat and mouse. Tripolitan captains, knowing every shoal and every current of their coast, skillfully broke through the blockade, making daring sorties. American officers had to learn on the fly. They had no supply bases in the region, no reliable maps, and no experience fighting a war far from home. Every barrel of fresh water, every pound of gunpowder became a logistical nightmare. The sea, which should have been a field of glory, turned into an exhausting adversary. Storms scattered the squadron, diseases decimated the crews, and diplomatic negotiations with other Maghreb countries resembled walking through a minefield. However, the most terrible blow awaited the Americans not in open battle, but as a result of a navigational error. On October 31, 1803, the frigate Philadelphia, under the command of the very same William Bainbridge who had endured humiliation in Algiers, pursued an enemy vessel and, at full speed, ran onto uncharted reefs in Tripoli harbor. Attempts to refloat the ship under the crossfire of shore batteries and enemy gunboats proved futile. To prevent the ship from falling into enemy hands in a serviceable condition, Bainbridge ordered the cannons scuttled and the gunpowder spoiled, after which he lowered the flag. 307 American sailors and officers were taken prisoner. It was a national catastrophe. Pasha Yusuf received not only invaluable hostages, for whom an astronomical ransom could be demanded, but also a powerful frigate, which the Tripolitans quickly refloated and began to repair. The balance of power in the region instantly shifted towards the pirates. On an internal level, in the offices of Washington and in the souls of the participants themselves, a drama of no less intensity unfolded. The capture of the Philadelphia crew was a shock to American society. Letters from the captives describing the horrors of imprisonment, hard labor, and meager rations were published in newspapers, stirring a wave of public anger and compassion. Jefferson found himself under a crossfire of criticism. His political opponents, the Federalists, accused him of sending the fleet without adequate preparation, condemning men to their doom. Within the Navy itself, an atmosphere of wounded pride prevailed. Officers felt a personal responsibility for the fate of their comrades. Commodore Edward Preble, who took command of the squadron, understood that simple patrolling was no longer enough. A daring, unconventional move was needed that would restore the initiative to the Americans and erase the shame of the ship's loss. It was here, at the point of greatest tension, that the ideological conflict of the era manifested itself. The clash was not simply between two countries, but between two world views. On one side, an archaic system where might makes right to plunder and people are commodities. On the other, a young republic proclaiming freedom of trade and human rights, but forced to use force to defend these ideals. The paradox was that, to protect freedom, America had to resort to the methods of an empire: projection of military force, intervention in the internal affairs of another state, and even the organization of a coup d'état. Jefferson, an apologist for liberty and non-intervention, was forced to sanction a covert operation to change the regime in Tripoli. This was a moment of national maturation, when idealistic notions collided with the harsh reality of geopolitics, and the nation chose action. The turning point that changed the course of history was the night of February 16, 1804. Young Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, at the head of a small group of volunteers, infiltrated Tripoli harbor on a captured local vessel, renamed the __0_. Under the cover of darkness, posing as local merchants who had lost their anchors in a storm, they approached the captured __1_ closely. Within minutes, the Americans boarded the ship, killed the guards, and, realizing that it was impossible to get the frigate out of the harbor, set it on fire. The __2_ flared up like a giant torch, illuminating the entire harbor and city. Decatur and his men escaped without losses, leaving the enemy in disarray. British Admiral Horatio Nelson called it, "3." The psychological effect was colossal. The myth of the pirates' invulnerability in their own lair was shattered. However, valor alone was not enough to win the war. A strategic solution was needed to break the will of Pasha Yusuf, and this solution came not from the sea, but from the desert. William Eaton, a former army captain and diplomat appointed as a naval agent to the Barbary States, entered the scene. Eaton was an adventurous man, far removed from armchair diplomacy. He proposed a plan that many considered madness: to find the Pasha's exiled brother, Hamet Karamanli, who was the legitimate heir to the throne, and help him regain power by force of arms. Jefferson, with a heavy heart, approved this operation, albeit with vague formulations of support. Eaton went to Egypt, found Hamet there, and assembled a motley army consisting of 8 American Marines, several dozen Greek and Italian mercenaries, and hundreds of Arab horsemen. In the spring of 1805, this strange army began its legendary march across the Libyan desert. Over 500 miles under the scorching sun, with a scarcity of water and provisions, through sands where it seemed no living thing could survive. Constant threats of mutiny from the mercenaries, distrust between Christians and Muslims in the detachment, Hamet's intrigues, who periodically fell into despair. Eaton had to use all his eloquence, charisma, and toughness to prevent the expedition from falling apart. This crossing became a test of the human spirit's strength. 8 Marines under the command of Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon became the steel core of this host, demonstrating discipline and endurance that astonished even seasoned mercenaries. They were not just marching to the city of Derna, they were marching to assert their country's new status. The climax came in April 1805, at the walls of Derna, the second largest city in Tripolitania. Eaton, understanding that time was against him, demanded the city's surrender. The governor replied laconically, __0_. On April 27th, the assault operation began. Supported by fire from the approaching American ships, "1", 2 and, quote, 3. Eaton's motley army went on the attack. It was a coordinated land and sea operation, the first in U.S. history. Marines and mercenaries, overcoming a hail of bullets, stormed into the city. Fierce street fighting culminated in the raising of the American flag over Derna's fortress. This was the first time in history that the Stars and Stripes flew over a captured fortification in the Old World. The capture of Derna created a real threat to the Pasha's capital. Yusuf Karamanli, realizing that his throne was shaking and seeing that the Americans were capable of a full-scale land invasion, abruptly changed his tone. At this moment, when complete victory and the overthrow of the tyrant seemed a matter of time, high diplomacy came into play. Tobias Lear, the U.S. Consul General, fearing for the lives of the prisoners in Tripoli and seeking to end the war quickly, concluded a peace treaty with Yusuf. The terms were a compromise. The U.S. paid $60,000 as ransom for the prisoners, which was significantly less than the initial demands. But no future tribute. The war ceased, the Americans withdrew from Derna, and Hamet Karamanli was once again sent into exile. For Eaton and his men, this was a bitter disappointment. They felt that their victory had been stolen by politicians, that they had betrayed an ally to whom they had given their word. Hamet, who had trusted the Americans, was abandoned to his fate, receiving only a modest pension. This morally ambiguous ending left a bitter taste, but the strategic goal was achieved. The practice of annual tribute was broken. The resonance of this war extended far beyond the Mediterranean and that specific historical moment. The First Barbary War became the crucible in which the character of the American Navy was forged. The names of Stephen Decatur, William Bainbridge, Edward Preble became legendary, setting a standard of courage and professionalism for future generations of sailors. The phrase from the Marine Corps hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli," immortalized the desert march and the storming of Derna. But more important was the lesson for national self-identification. America proved, primarily to itself, that it was not a secondary player that could be plundered with impunity. This was the first step from isolationism to an awareness of global interests. Economic freedom, it turned out, required a willingness to defend it with the force of arms. Furthermore, the war taught an important lesson about the limits of power and the complexity of international relations. The betrayal by Hamet Karamanli served as a reminder that in grand politics, interests often prevail over ideals and promises. This was the first experience of regime change and intervention in internal affairs, which showed how easily one could get bogged down in someone else's civil war and how difficult it was then to emerge from it with clean hands. America was learning to be a superpower, making mistakes, getting bumps and bruises, but steadily moving towards understanding its role in the world. The experience of the war with the pirates showed the need for a constant naval presence to protect trade, which led to the abandonment of Jefferson's idea of a coastal defense navy in favor of building ocean-going ships. Ultimately, the significance of those events cannot be overestimated. If we mentally return to the deck of the George Washington in 1800, we will see a captain forced to bow his head before insolent force. 5 years later, in 1805, the picture was dramatically different. American ships patrolled the sea as masters of the situation, not as victims. The pirates, who had terrorized Europe for centuries, encountered a nation that chose to spend millions on gunpowder and lead, rather than give a single cent for a humiliating ransom. This conflict laid the foundation for modern U.S. foreign policy, a readiness to project force anywhere in the world where national interests are affected. The world changed. The ancient practice of buying security gave way to the doctrine of security through force. The events of those years showed that sovereignty is not just a declaration on paper, but the ability to protect one's citizens and values through real actions. Europe, which had observed the conflict from a distance, was surprised to discover that the overseas republic had teeth. And for Americans themselves, this marked the definitive end of the era of colonial thinking. They ceased to be part of the British world or victims of circumstances, becoming creators of their own destiny on the international stage. The flag that was once forced down in Algiers now proudly flew over a fortress in Africa, symbolizing not just a military victory, but the birth of a new global power that everyone would now have to reckon with. The echo of the cannons of the quote, 0 and quote, 1 faded over the waters of the Mediterranean. But the consequences of those salvos are still heard today. History has shown that peace is not bought with concessions to an aggressor, but is won by the determination to stand until the end. Those distant events of the early 19th century became the first chapter in the long book of American intervention in world affairs, defining the vector of development for centuries to come. And although the sands of time have covered the traces of Eaton's march in the desert, the principle of millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became part of the national genetic code, reminding us that freedom is never free, and respect is not given simply. It must be earned and, if necessary, defended in battle.